Southwest Missouri State University Department of Geography-Geology presents Land and Life in the Ozarks. This course is one of several units of study offered in Ozark Regional Studies at SMSU and is designed to enhance appreciation of the cultural heritage of this region.
The theme of this lecture is transportation and communication in the Ozarks. It's certainly an important theme in understanding the geography and history of the region. Certainly isolation and difficulties of travel have been used time and time again to explain the lack of economic development and the low standard of living in the region, at least in the past. The discussion today will focus on the major forms of transportation, that is, the rivers, roads, and railroads. We'll be looking at the degree of persistence versus change. We'll be looking at some of the old and some of the new. I think a good place to begin is to discuss the rivers as routes of transportation in the Ozarks. It's a logical starting point because it was the exclusive, or nearly the exclusive, means of carrying bulky commodities in the early days of settlement in the region. Certainly the French voyageurs and coureurs de bois who traded with the Indians and penetrated the river valleys in order to seek out the furs that they were after, traveled into some of the smallest of the Ozark streams. But on the major rivers, keel boats and flat boats were the main types of boats that were used. And it is really amazing how much traffic had been generated on the rivers prior to the introduction of steam navigation. Recently I was reading a report on the New Madrid Earthquake, and so many of the reports of the destruction caused by the earthquake were from people who were on the river at that time in 1811. Keel boats and flat boats were cast up on the shore and stranded. If we could look at the first slide, then we see in this picture a view of the interior of one of the flatboats from about the 1820s. In the later days, boats like this were enclosed, and this one even had a fireplace so that the men could cook and live on board. In the next slide, we see an advertisement for a packet boat. By 1817, the first steamboat had called it a Missouri port on the Mississippi, and soon regular packet service was established on the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. This particular one, the Polar Star, operated between St. Joseph and St. Louis, leaving St. Joseph every Tuesday at 4 o'clock. That is, every other Tuesday at 4 o'clock. It was a 2-week round trip. In the next picture, we see an example of one of the early packet boats that operated on the river. Then in the next picture, we see the waterfront at St. Louis in the late 1870s, when river navigation was extremely important. If we could then look at the poster that I have, we'll see we go back to a poster that I organized or put together at the beginning of the course, showing the boundaries of the Ozarks. Actually, the interior Ozarks were relatively untouched by water navigation. I've marked the major ports on the Missouri River. That would be Boonville here. Jefferson City, of course, was a major port. Herman downstream. St. Louis, as I've already mentioned, was the most important port in the interior. St. Genevieve and Cape Girardeau, both on the Mississippi. In the south, Batesville was an important all year-round port on the White River. It could be reached in all seasons of the year. One reason for the early settlement around Batesville was that it was a port of call for steamboats. Then during periods of high water, Doniphan could be reached on the current river, and during phases of extremely high water, it was possible to reach into Shannon County at eminence. On the White River, navigation was possible during high stages of the river at Forsyth. Then on the northern border, the Osage River was navigable during high water. It was closed during the winter, but for about half the year, 6 months of the year, steamboats could reach up to Warsaw, and then during the summer months, during the high water, they could reach as far as Osceola. But for the most part, the interior Ozarks were relatively untouched or had little trade with the by way of the rivers. That's still true today, that the Ozarks, the major navigable streams are peripheral to the Ozarks, and for that matter, the Ozarks simply do not produce grains or other heavy commodities that are transported by means of barges. But barge transportation is important on the major rivers, the Missouri and the Mississippi. If we could have the next slide now, we see an example of a tow coming up the Mississippi River. This is pushed by the United States, which is the largest motor vessel on the Mississippi. Can push as many as 40 barges, which would be equivalent to a train with 400 cars on board. The Missouri carries much grain. The Mississippi carries grain and coal and petroleum products and manufactured goods as well. The Arkansas River is navigable to Tulsa, but as yet, or to the port of Catoosa, but as yet it does not carry much traffic. So much for the rivers. Now, if we could turn our attention to the early roads in Missouri, most of the early roads were in the north and eastern parts of the Ozarks, or in the Missouri portion of the Ozarks. The first roads were the trails, of course, established by the Indians as they traded and carried on warfare and hunted. And it's surprising how close the modern highways follow these early Indian trails, partly because they were the easiest routes through the region, and partly because towns soon became established along these routes, and there was a certain inertia that built up along the routes of transportation. If we could look at the next slide, then we see one of the first roads that was built in the Ozarks. It was called the Three Notch Road, built from St. Genevieve into Mine La Motte, or the mines at La Motte, called the Three Notch Road because the trees were marked with three notches, and it was simply hacked out. By hacking it out, I mean they literally hacked it out, because the stumps were not removed, simply cut off short enough so that the wagons could pass over them. In a few years later, several years later, they built roads into the other mines, and finally a plank road was built. And we see this in the next slide, an early plank road built into the iron mines and the lead mines, but large quantities of timber were also hauled, and agricultural products were hauled too. In the next picture, we see another early road in Missouri that paralleled the Mississippi border in the east. It was called the King's Highway. It was laid out by the Spanish to link St. Louis, St. Genevieve, Cape Girardeau, and New Madrid. The plans for this road were laid in 1776, 200 years ago this year. The Highway 62 and also Interstate 55 follow very closely on this early road. The most important road for the interior Ozarks we see in the next slide. This was the Ridge Road, or sometimes known as the Springfield Road, or the Osage Trace, because it led west from St. Louis to the Osage country, and later known as the Old Wire Road, because the telegraph wire leading to Fort Smith also followed along this route. It was always the most important route through the Ozarks. It essentially followed the water divides and so was fairly easily traveled. Route 66 followed this route. The Atlantic Pacific or Frisco route of the railroad was built along this line, and today, of course, Interstate 44 follows this route. Well, so much for the early roads. If we can then turn our attention to railroads, I want to come back to roads a little later, but we need to talk about railroads because certainly railroads played an important part in shaping the economic and cultural geography of the region. Railroads were built to tap the mineral resources and to tap lumber resources, to service farms, to haul away the products of farms in the towns that were located along the tracks. If I'd like to show you the progression of railroad building with a slide that has 4 maps. In the upper left, we see a map. All of these maps, of course, of Missouri. Most of the railroad building did radiate from St. Louis. St. Louis was the primate city of the Midwest until it was finally surpassed by Chicago, and it rivaled Chicago as a railroad center. In the upper left, we see the situation in 1852, and you may just make out a short line built westward from St. Louis. This was the Pacific route. The map looks nearly bare, and it was, for that matter, just the beginnings of railroad building in 1852. In the upper right, you see the situation in 1858. By this time, the Pacific route was built west. The Pacific line was built west along the Missouri River. There was a slight branch, you can just make it out, where the southwest branch of the Pacific had just begun by 1858. And then built into the interior Ozarks was the St. Louis and Iron Mountain route that reached Pilot Knob by 1858. Jefferson City was served by 1855. Following the Civil War, there was a tremendous boost in railroad building. We see the situation in the lower left in 1864, which was during the Civil War. The railroad did reach Rolla, so there was very little building then. But after the Civil War, the map in the lower right shows the situation in 1870. And Springfield had rail service by 1870, the Atlantic and Pacific route. By 1881, another line was built in from Kansas City. And by 1886, yet another line from Kansas City was built to the city of Springfield. And then a third line was built in 1906, a branch line of the Missouri Pacific. No less than 5 lines were built into the Tri-State District to tap the lead and zinc traffic of that region. If we can look at the next slide then, we see a map of land grants that were made. That is, the area that shows up in white were areas that were granted to the railroads for the construction of track. And although most of it is in the north and in the western states, it's in Iowa and Minnesota, certainly the Ozarks, Missouri and Arkansas, substantial grants were given to the railroads in these locations also. I'd like next to look at the poster that I've put together that shows the railroads as they exist today, or at least the main lines. And essentially this map was intact, or most of the main lines were built by 1890. There were 2 roads that paralleled the Missouri River heading west from St. Louis. The Rock Island line was built across the northern Ozark border. The names here have changed. The original rail lines went by different names. There were many, many reorganizations. But the St. Louis and San Francisco route into the Springfield and to the Tri-State District was established, as I've already said, by 1870. The Memphis route was, of the St. Louis and San Francisco, was in the 1880s. The Missouri Pacific had built their White River route to the southeast by the 1890s. St. Louis and San Francisco route had built south to Fayetteville and on across the Boston Mountains. The Kansas City Southern had built into the Oklahoma Ozarks. And then if we look at the eastern Ozarks, the St. Louis and Iron Mountain Road was built to Poplar Bluff, and there was a railroad south bordering the Mississippi River. The only new lines really that have been built since about 1890 in the Ozarks are spur lines. The most recent of these are the spur line that's been built to Pea Ridge, which is an iron mine in Washington County, and the spur line of the St. Louis and San Francisco, or the Frisco, built out to the new lead belt in Iron County. Really, the history of and geography of railroading has been one of decline. And if we can look at the next poster, we see an example of this. I took a map of railroads in 1910 and compared it to the current situation, and what I have mapped here on this map are the abandoned lines. And you see that most of them are either parallel lines, that is, they paralleled another railroad, or they were branch lines, spurs that were built into timber tracks or into mining districts. I'll just point out a couple of examples to make my point here. This is the Kansas City, Clinton, and Springfield, which was built to Springfield. During the reorganization, when it was bought by the Frisco line, it was then abandoned. The Missouri and North Arkansas line down through the White River country simply didn't generate enough traffic, and it has in recent years been abandoned. The Missouri Pacific branch line to Springfield has recently been abandoned. Branch line from Mount Vernon to Greenfield has been abandoned. There was a narrow gauge track, kind of an interesting railroad, built from Mansfield to Ava, which was abandoned, and there's an interesting bit of history with that. The entire rolling stock was virtually destroyed when a part of the train came unhooked and rolled back down the hill and hit the other cars that were loaded with strawberries there. In this district, in Crawford and Phelps and Dent County, there are several short lines that were built into the iron mines and also built into the timber to obtain charcoal to fuel the furnaces. The St. Louis, Sligo, and East, rather exotic name for a railroad of no more than 20 miles length, built out to obtain hardwood that could be manufactured into charcoal to keep the Sligo furnace going. A number of railroads were abandoned in the old lead belt. The Missouri Southern was a line built from Leeper up into Shannon County and terminated it at a number of different mining camps. If we come in very close, you can see some of these. Another of these logging railroads was the Salem, Winona, and Southern that was built in Shannon County. Reynolds and Shannon County were both important logging counties. Also, the Williamsville, Greenville, and St. Louis was another of these logging railroads that has since been abandoned. One of the most interesting short-line railroads in the Ozarks is in southwest Missouri, the Cassville and Exeter, which this line was only 4.8 miles long. And if I can have the next slide, we see a picture of the old Cassville and Exeter, which ran 4.8 miles. It took 80 minutes to make it. There were no turntables, and once the route was made uphill from Cassville to Exeter, the train was simply back down the hill to Exeter. It operated this way for many, many years. Passenger service has long since been abandoned in most of the Ozarks, as it has across most of, or a good part of the United States, particularly in the sparsely populated sections. If we can see the next slide, we see the passenger depot at Springfield, now abandoned. There has been no traffic out of this since the late 1960s. In the late 40s, in 1947, there were 22 passenger trains a day operating from this depot. Well, the impact of railroads was significant on not only immigration, which we've mentioned previously, but I'll be talking about the impact of railroads on agriculture, on the development of commercial dairy farming and commercial fruit farming. And certainly railroads were extremely important in the location of towns. During the 1970s, we've already seen several centennial celebrations, and during the 80s we'll see more centennial celebrations as the railroad towns celebrate their first 100 years since their founding during the era of railroad building. Let's go back to roads again and look at the condition of the early day roads in the Ozarks. And I want to show several pictures that will illustrate the kinds of roads that people had to travel and the way that roads were maintained. Road construction was relatively simple in the early days because the chert served as a sort of natural hard surface. Even though roads were relatively easy to build, they were rough, and even the stagecoaches and wagons that had to travel over them had a difficult time doing it. Let's look at the first slide. Here we see a stagecoach in the Ozarks operating. I don't have the location on this, but it was operating in 1905. By this time already it was having competition from not only railroads, but also from the automobile, which was entering the scene by this time. In the next picture, we see a picture. This is an interesting picture I got from an old geological survey report. It is a road from Lynn to Lebanon, and the roads had no ditches, and of course the water simply drained into the road, and this is the result. If you look in the background, I'm not sure you can distinguish it here. The picture is rather old. There is a buggy and a wagon, or a buggy and a team coming down this road, and you can imagine how slow they have to travel and how rough the ride must have been to travel over this type of road. Then if we could look at the next slide, we see a wagon here in a muddy road, and if the wagon is loaded, of course, this presented some problem of carrying heavy loads on a road that was not well surfaced. In the next picture, if we could have it, we see the main street of Herculaneum, Missouri, on the eastern Ozark border in the 1890s. The streets are rutted. Normally the streets weren't serviced until automobiles became fairly common. In the next slide we see another picture of the same sort of thing. Here we have the main street of Fordland, Missouri in the 1880s, and again you see boardwalk sidewalks, but certainly no surfacing on the streets. And if we can look at the next picture, this is the Aurora celebrating the 4th of July in 1907, and they have all 6 cars that were in Aurora at that time. The problem, of course, in the early days was even if you had a car, there weren't very good roads on which to drive it. In the next picture, we see some of the early cars traveling down the church-surfaced roads, what few there were available to travel on. Maintenance, if we can look at the next picture then, maintenance of the roads was very poor. Here we see an extremely rutted road, so poor in fact that mail was delivered by horse and buggy or on horseback for many, many years. If we could look at the next picture, we see an example of this, a picture taken from a history book which shows a Mr. Johnson at Rogersville delivering mail in 1934. And I read in the history of Christian County that a gentleman there delivered mail on horseback until 1955. I was amazed at this. In fact, I searched out that gentleman and talked to him. He confirmed the fact that he did indeed deliver mail on horseback in the Bull Creek neighborhood until 1955. He said there was really no problem except when someone would order a stove or something like this from the Montgomery Ward catalog, and then that presented some problems in managing to deliver it. If we could look at the next picture, we see that maintenance of the roads was usually fairly crude. They used a drag. Normally it was done on a township basis. There was a township overseer who would be paid, but then each male citizen was theoretically at least obligated to spend 2 days a year maintaining roads, or 1 day a year if he had a team of horses and a drag. In the next picture we see one of the common drags. It was called a split log drag or a split plank drag, and this was about all the maintenance that was used. Then if we can look at the next picture, we see construction of roads where they did construct roads with fill. You can imagine hauling the fill dirt in with team and wagon was a long and arduous process, and no wonder so few roads were built. In the next slide, we see the first of the graders or road patrols, which allowed them to ditch the roads and to allow for proper drainage. Stream crossings were extremely simple. Footbridges, fords, water gaps, or low water bridges were the typical stream crossings. And if we can look at the next slide then, we see an early day stream crossing, simple footbridge, and if we could have the next slide, we see that the footbridge has not entirely passed from the scene. And there are still some to be seen in the interior parts of the Ozarks. This one was built by the Trappist monks in eastern Douglas County. In the next picture, we see a pontoon bridge, which was a common way of crossing the larger streams in the early days. In the next picture, we see the ferry at Owl's Bend on the Current River. This was the most common method of crossing a major stream, and there are many ferries that still operate in the interior districts of the Ozarks because the traffic is light and it is a costly proposition to build a road. In the next picture, here we see a solid bedrock ford which is easily traversed. Some of the fords are on chert, and then it's necessary to get a run at some of those with the vehicle in order to get through because the vehicle will become mired in the chert. In the next picture, we see an improvement on the ford. It is the water gap in which the road is surfaced and the water is allowed to run over it. This is the water gap on Black River in the St. Francis Mountains. You see a gauge at the left of the road there, which gives you some indication of whether it's safe to cross the stream. Each year, a number of lives are lost in the Ozarks because people attempt to ford these streams when the water is high. In the next picture, we see an example of one of the few covered bridges, the Burfordville Bridge on the Whitewater River. Very few of these were built in the Ozarks because they were expensive and the roads were none too good and not much traffic. In the next picture, we see here we see one of the iron bridges that were built in the late 1800s and early 1900s, high above the level of the floods. Most of these are dated in the 1890s to about 1910. In the next picture, we see one of the modern highways that are being built in the Ozarks, have been built since about the 1950s. 4 lanes, they provide rapid transit into the interior districts of the Ozarks, and have been very important in rural to urban migration and in breaking down the isolation of the Ozarks. In the next picture, we see the interstate system of the Ozarks are peripheral. The only major interstate is Interstate 44 that goes down the old Ridge Road into the interior districts of the Ozarks. And if we can look at the next picture, we see a radial pattern of roads coming into Salem, Missouri, which follows the old trails, and there is a rectangular system following the rectangular land survey system. In the next picture, in the vicinity of Springfield, we see the same thing, the major highways radiating from Springfield, and then in the background a rectangular road system of the farm to market roads. Then finally, in the last slide, we see the north part of the slide is in the Springfield Plain, the rectangular road system. As the rougher country is encountered in the in southern Christian County, we see the roads following the ridges and valleys. This will conclude then the presentation on transportation. In the next lecture, I'll be talking about the mining and mining districts of the Ozarks.
For course information concerning land and life in the Ozarks, contact Dr. Milton Rafferty, Department Head, Geography Geology, Southwest Missouri State University, Springfield, Missouri, 65802.